Good morning. The Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States will now come to order. The hearing we are having today will, I hope, be heartbreaking at the same time that is illuminating, because we are going to hear from witnesses who will paint a picture of the disrepair and neglect that the federal government has allowed to those peoples, the Indigenous peoples, Native Hawaiians, Native Alaskans, Native Americans, to whom we owe a trust responsibility. The committee hearing, however, is entitled Infrastructure in Indigenous Communities, Priorities for the American Jobs Act. And this subcommittee hearing is really intended to take that sense of disrepair and neglect and give us a roadmap of what we should be doing so that we not only just build back better, but at sometimes actually build for the first time. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Hearing no objection, so ordered. As described in the hearing notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note, as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I will begin by recognizing myself for my opening statement. As I said earlier, the testimony today is heartbreaking to hear because of the painting of federal neglect of our obligations, from the dilapidated and impassable roads to health clinics not built and therefore not there when we faced a pandemic, to homes without running water or electricity. But this hearing, Infrastructure in Indigenous Communities, Priorities for the American Jobs Plan,
the fifth
is
floor.
to highlight what Congress and this administration can do to address those infrastructure inequities. Congressman, if we could, everyone please mute if they are not speaking. Thank you. And in my view, the brilliance of their American Jobs Plan is that it takes a holistic view to infrastructure. After all, our witnesses know that the things that keep our communities moving are not just roads and bridges, but also broadband, healthcare, clean water, childcare centers. So if we believe that addressing the inequities in our country is an important goal of the jobs plan, then we must prioritize these fundamental services, and we must prioritize those communities who have been the most neglected. And it is that charge that I believe that every member of this subcommittee holds dear and will work towards. We will hear from our witness today about numerous infrastructure issues. Transportation presents one of the most glaring problems. About 161,000 miles of roads in tribal lands are eligible for federal funding. Tribal nations and Bureau of Indian Affairs own and operate about a quarter of these roads. Although several funding streams are available for tribal governments, chronic underfunding and backlogs have resulted in inefficient infrastructure improvements. For example, the 2018 BIA survey estimated that deferred maintenance backlog was $498 million, almost $500 million. But yet last year, we allocated a fraction of that, $36.79 million. A stark indication of this neglect, as President Killer notes in his testimony, is that states receive an average of about $16,000 per mile of state-controlled roads, whereas tribes receive about 1/64th of that. For example, the Ogallala Sioux tribe receives just $900 per BIA mile. The lack of broadband connectivity and development cannot be emphasized enough. We will hear it over and over again today, and I hope in every committee hearing that we hold. Tribal communities are among the most underserved populations for broadband. Even today, geographic remoteness and lack of infrastructure remain barriers. Although federal agencies like the FCC are aware of this longstanding issue, tribal nations are only eligible for support through a piecemeal network of competitive funding opportunities. There are no dedicated funding streams specific for tribal applicants or non-tribal entities. And as somebody who both put in broadband and was frustrated when I couldn't get broadband in Indian country, I know how frustrating it is to work with federal agencies that don't understand the tribal infrastructure needs or jurisdiction. So while we received tribal communities received broadband funding through CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, we must remember those remain COVID related. So we must have and push for a dedicated funding for tribal broadband infrastructure. Alongside these priorities, we will hear more about housing and lands infrastructure issues. 100 years ago, Congress passed the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act to provide for the rehabilitation of Native Hawaiian individuals through a government-sponsored homesteading program. But right now, we know that demand for those leases has consistently outstripped the available supply, and we have 28,000 applicants on the homestead waiting list. And we will also hear about IHS. So the IHS the IHS priority list hasn't been updated since 1992. So these are only a few of the many issues we'll learn about today. As we advocate for fully funding infrastructure needs, I'd also ask our witness to highlight structural deficiencies in existing infrastructure programs. Should we change matching requirements for tribes seeking federal funding? Should we provide grant writing assistance? Should we create set-asides targeted at Indigenous communities within existing federal programs? So I look forward to our hearing today, and I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Don Young for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for an excellent opening statement. I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record my total opening statement. I would like to also remind my witnesses and my chairman that a lot of what she says is reality, but maybe this bill won't carry that much. We have to write the bill, I suggest, for the First Americans Recovery Act or something. But the fact is, what you say about clinics and child care and all these things are reality. But whether will be included in this bill is another story. That's something we were discussing right now. I met with President Biden and Vice President Harris, and I'm for the amount of money they say. I just don't know whether we have the ability to carry through to have a transportation bill that goes outside of a great deal of bridges and roads and airports and ports and the whole bit. The interest in the public is that right now. But for the tribes, we have to look at what we haven't been able to do because of the trust authority, what we have not kept up with. I was chairman of the Transportation Committee and wrote the last good transportation bill. And in that, I included a large segment of the monies for the tribes, but not nearly enough. It's all I could get at that time. And a formula so that most all tribes are eligible for it. And you know, you're right about the disparity of between the state and the tribes. And our job, I believe, Madam Chair, is to see if we can't come to a solution of these problems, if not in this bill, and another bill. And that's what we'll attempt to do, because it's badly needed, and it is a soft government concept. If a state gets a certain amount, I think the tribes should get a portion amount too. So that's something we'll work on, because you know, transportation provides an economic base for everyone, and I've always said that a good sound transportation system makes a great economy for the nation and for the tribes. We don't have it, we'd have failed. And by the way, I happen to drive through your state on I-10. A lot of areas that road is good, and a lot of areas it's not so good. But it's one of the main arteries from the West Coast to the East Coast. I'd like to see our main arteries upgraded so we can import, export, make our economy strong. So I look forward to the witnesses. We have one from Alaska and I guess one from Hawaii and all around the area. And so, Mr. Case, I got up early this morning and you got up early this morning. So let's hear from the witnesses. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Congressman Dean. And yes, we will work together on that comprehensive bill to address these issues. I would now like to transition to our first panel of witnesses for today. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer written statement for the record if you choose, and we have your longer statements. You may add to your statements as well. When you begin, the on-screen timer will begin counting down and it'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the grid view so that they may lock the timer on their screen. When you go over the allotted time, I will ask you to please wrap up your statement so that everybody has time to add to the conversation today. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. We will have 2 panels. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Kevin Killer, who is president for the Ogallala Sioux Tribe. President Killer.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. And thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, good deal. Helmadak Yapi, Makat, Ikilia, Himie, Chante, Washte, Nape, Chuzapilo. That is our greeting, Lakota. I shake your hands with a warm and good heart. My Lakota name is Close to Earth, and my English name is Kevin Killer. I am the current president of the Oglala Lakota Nation. We're located in Southwest South Dakota. Greetings, Congressman Young. It's good to see you. I know we met several times from several groups and stuff like that. So I appreciate all your advocacy for all the Native communities for all these years. And it is true, you're a really strong advocate, and that's one of the best things that we need. And I can start. Thank you for conducting this critical hearing as part of Congress's process for considering and hopefully enacting the President's America Jobs Plan. Infrastructure has long been a priority for our tribe. Our position is that infrastructure must be broadly defined. It includes not just roads and bridges, but broadband, water, housing, education, community facilities, public safety, and other components that make a community livable. Today, our testimony focuses on the pressing roads needs on our reservation and offers recommendations on how Congress can address them going forward. First is road needs. The Pine Ridge Indian Reservation covers a 2.8 million acre, roughly the size of Connecticut. Across this vast experience, we maintain 560 miles of BIA roads and bridges on a shoestring budget of roughly $890 per mile, as the chairwoman mentioned. We also have about 1,900 miles of tribal roads for which we receive no federal funding. In comparison, the state of South Dakota spends $4,020 per mile on its roads. And I know because I used to serve in the South Dakota legislature for 10 years. Today, our testimony focuses on the pressing needs on our reservation and offers a recommendations on how Congress can address them going forward. Infrastructure has long been a priority for our tribe. Our position is that infrastructure must. Oh, I'm sorry, I got too far ahead. So, there are 26 bridges on our reservation that are on average 75 years old. There is a safe lifespans are at or beyond limit. Bridge and road maintenance comes from the same federal pot, however, which further stresses on our budget. The incurred cost to maintain our infrastructure far exceeds available funding. As a result, we are consistently operating on emergency response. Added to this are the challenges of being a Great Plains travel nation. Snow and ice removal can consume up to 65% of our annual budget each winter. A single set of snowplow blades costs $300 and must be replaced every 1 to 2 weeks. Potholes, mud, snow-laden roads create dangerous conditions that impact school attendance, employment, tourism, household costs, and vehicle safety. We simply cannot get ahead of our roads needs under the current conditions. We have worked hard to bring attention to and address our desperate conditions, including by initiating a travel survey of the roads condition. Something must change at the federal level. Road infrastructure is ripe for bold solutions. Our recommendation is our tribe believes that the American Jobs Plan an annual appropriations process or prime vehicles for this change. To that end, my written testimony lays out 8 clear recommendations for the subcommittee consideration. I will briefly discuss 5 of them here. First, we recommend that Congress provide not less than $75 million for BIA road maintenance in fiscal year 2022. Due to persistent underfunding, the program has a backlog of deferred needs of almost $300 million nationwide, $60 million of it which is in the Great Plains alone. A dramatic increase in the funding over its current level of $36.79 million is urgently required. Secondly, and relatedly, we recommend Congress create a new $30 million BIA road maintenance sub-account that targets backlog projects by taking mile inventory, remoteness, and weather conditions into account. This would have long-term benefits in reducing deferred needs in the Great Plains and elsewhere. Third, we urge the establishment of a permanent BIA roads maintenance emergency weather fund. Snowstorms and other extreme weather events drain tribal road budgets each year. Our tribe suffered a devastating flood in 2019, from which we are still recovering. A permanent BIA relief fund would help alleviate this burden and assist tribal nations caught in emergency events. Fourth, mechanisms for accounting for a tribally generated data should be incorporated into OMB and BIA reporting process. Tribally driven data provides the most accurate picture of our program's performance on ground condition, yet GPRA and other systems do not currently account for it. Finally, for this statement, we encourage Congress and the administration to engage with the BIA and tribal leaders on accurately identifying the needs and appropriate distribution formulas for addressing the tribal roads infrastructure under the American Jobs Plan. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the hearing. I invite all of you to visit our nation and travel these roads for yourself. I know some of you have been here, and we would love to host you all. Thank you, Congress. Thank you, Congress. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member.
Thank you, President Killer. The chair would now recognize the Honorable William J. Aila, who is the chairman of the Hawaiian Homes Commission. Chairman.
Thank you, and aloha, Chair Ledger Fernandez, Ranking Member Young, Congressman Case, and other members of the Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples of the United States. Thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, especially as this year marks the 100th anniversary of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, spearheaded by Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalanianaole, which set aside public lands called Hawaiian Homelands as a rehabilitated program for Native Hawaiians. Today, the department is responsible for the management of approximately 200,000 acres of these trust lands, nearly 10,000 homestead leases statewide, and over 45,000 lease applications. Most of these lands are located in rural and remote locations. I appreciate the opportunity to share the following priorities for the American Jobs Plan by highlighting the areas that align with the needs of Native Hawaiians while also suggesting an expansion in the area of critical need in many indigenous communities. Infrastructure funding. Funding of over $145 million for lot development and over $225 million for the repair and maintenance of infrastructure, including sewer and water systems, would provide the level of infusion needed to quicken the pace of homestead development. A dedicated, consistent, and reliable stream of funding allows for steady production of lots. The department also owns and operates water systems on 3 islands. Another component of infrastructure funding is cesspool conversion. This infrastructure funding is in line with the American Jobs priority to rebuild clean drinking water infrastructure across rural America to include Hawaiian homelands. Continued support for Title 8 of NAHASDA. NAHASDA funding is essential for Hawaiian households most in need, and with continued support, increased funding, reauthorization, and expansion of NAHASDA, even more Native Hawaiians could realize the legacy of Prince Kuhio through the award of a homestead lease. This continued support is part of the American Jobs Plan to rebuild and preserve and retrofit more than 2 million homes to address affordable housing crisis in underserved communities nationwide, including rural and tribal areas. Addressing climate change. Hawaii is already feeling the impacts of climate change. And as time progresses, these effects, rising sea levels, rising temperatures, declining rainfall, and increasing cycles of drought, will be more prominent aspects of our lives. Sea level is rising at increasing rates, indicating a growing vulnerability to coastal flooding and erosion. Sea level rise also affects cultural practices like fish pond maintenance, the harvesting of salt, and the gathering from nearshore fisheries. Climate change and forest loss are working together to make Hawaii drier and hotter. Hawaii lost a higher proportion of total land area to wildfires than the 12 fire-prone states in the western United States combined from 2005 to 2011. Warming waters are harming sea life, and warmer oceans are causing more frequent and intense extreme weather events. Rainfall has declined significantly over the past 30 years, with increasing variation in rainfall patterns on each of our islands. The American Jobs Plan priority to make infrastructure more resilient to safeguarding critical infrastructure by safeguarding critical infrastructure and services, defending vulnerable communities to the restoration of nature-based infrastructure is fundamental to responding to climate change. Broadband infrastructure. Many in Hawaii, primary from rural and socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, lack the necessary digital tools. In an effort to address this need, the department received approval from the FCC for unassigned spectrum, which will allow for rural homestead communities along with rural tribal communities all across the country to bridge the connectivity divide. Funding for mitigation of lands used by the federal government. One area of the American Jobs Plan could be expanded is to provide for funding for mitigation of lands used by the federal government to clean up properties that were formerly owned, leased, possessed, or used by the military or other defense agencies. Increased funding must be provided to address the unexploded ordnance and contamination. In closing, I wish to express my appreciation and gratitude for giving me the opportunity to testify. It has been an honor to have this opportunity to address the subcommittee. The department stands ready to assist in accomplishing most of this work of ensuring the priorities identified by Indigenous communities are included in the American Jobs Plan. It is my hope that the American Job Plan results in the expansion of the infrastructure of humanity, building hope, providing opportunities for our families and communities, and the restoration of spirit to both the land and the people. Mahalo, and please continue to be safe.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Chair Aila.
Madam Chair,
Chair would now like to recognize Ranking Member Young for the introduction of the next witness.
thank you, Madam Chair. It's my honor to introduce Alaskan witness Megan Stimfel. She's a South Governance Liaison, Norton Sound Health Corporation in Nome, Alaska, great gold rush town. She's tirelessly worked on these issues for many years. Although she's quite young, she's been working when she first started in elementary school. She's always optimistic for a better future for the Alaska Natives and upon the region of Norton Sound and across the state of Alaska. So it's a great honor to work with her over the years I've been in Congress. By the way, Megan, I think that you was first started when I was first elected. You were still had diapers, so we'll see it out. Megan, welcome to the hearing. Thank you,
The-
Madam Chair.
The chair
Thank you.
now recognizes Ms. Stifel for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Young. That is a nice introduction. We have a saying in Alaska that Congressman Young is our congressman for life, and that's true in the sense of my lifespan. I want to thank you, Chairwoman Ledger Fernandez, Ranking Member Young, for the opportunity to testify today. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the 20 federally recognized tribes of the Bering Strait region. The American Jobs Plan offers real hope, and following up on our esteemed elder from Hawaii, hope is what drives our future. Hope is what drives our economy. We all know what consumer confidence means to our economy. In our case, it's hope for clean water. Clean water will create jobs. We have tremendous export potential in our region. As you know, Congressman Young, we can export reindeer, we can export fish, and we are right next door to Asia. It's one of the biggest markets in the world. The only thing holding us back in our future is clean water. We urge in the American Jobs Plan that you provide direct focus on establishing a path to service for unserved communities and unserved homes. And also the repair and replacement of aging infrastructure is really important. It's unfortunate, you know, we go into each season on a prayer that our public health infrastructure doesn't fail. We have failing water storage tanks in Diomede and in Gamble. Those are two communities that are right at the border with the United States and Russia. And the irony is that the funding that Congress appropriates for Alaska Native villages is not reaching our unserved communities. Our unserved communities are not on a path to service, and it's my hope that through this plan, we can establish that priority for our unserved communities. The first-time service projects take 5 to 10 years to complete, costing about $350,000 to $750,000 per home. As you know, Congressman Young, the cost of construction in our rural communities is incredibly challenging, but our challenges are not insurmountable. I truly believe that the reason the costs are so high is because of the regulations that the IHS imposes on our communities that delays construction, that increase the cost of construction. So we really need a regulatory paradigm that respects our short construction season, because the reality is we have to have all the design work done in order to have materials ordered to get on the spring barge. So that means we have between June and November to get materials, to get pipe laid, to replace projects and pieces. So we have to be a year in advance. And, we have a failing water treatment plant in Diomede. We have a failing water storage tank, and it's because of agency regulations that we won't be able to repair that water storage tank in this construction season. So we hope 2022, but it's not a way to live when you have to hope that things won't fail and people won't go without clean water. So I am really excited this moment and this time. We have something we can do right. We have the opportunity to do something that hasn't been done before, and that's prioritizing our unserved communities and our tribes with the ability to map our own path to service. And we can. We've hired our own engineer at North Sound Health Corporation because we don't want to wait for for agencies to give us the green light. So I'll remain on for questions. I want to wrap up my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward to being a resource.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for your testimony. We have also on with us the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, and I'd like to give him an opportunity to provide an opening statement. Congressman Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us. And Madam Chair, again, with the difficulties we have with these remote hearings, I hope that since everyone's been vaccinated or had the opportunity to be vaccinated, that soon we can get back to in-person meetings here in the committee room. It is no secret that infrastructure plays a crucial role in boost economic development. It creates jobs and increases the quality of life. Nowhere is this more important than tribal communities. There is, however, a great need throughout Indian country for quality infrastructure, the lack of which creates barriers to economic development, higher quality of life, and human health and safety. On March 31st, President Biden released his American Jobs Plan. Unfortunately, the proposed plan has very little information as to how the infrastructure needs in Indian country that fall under this committee's jurisdiction will be addressed. Even with the lofty price tag north of $2 trillion, this plan fails to prioritize infrastructure needs, those most pressing needs in Indian country. In 2017, this committee held an oversight hearing examining Indian healthcare facility infrastructure. Witnesses told the committee that most Indian healthcare facilities could only handle 52% of the services needed by their communities because of funding shortfalls. And the average age of an IHS hospital is approximately 40 years old. That's quadruple the age of an average hospital in the United States. With current construction funding provided by Congress, facilities would need to last 400 years before they could be replaced. Additionally, the president's plan would invest less than 6% on roads and bridges and less than 5% on broadband in Indian country, both of which are critical areas of need. Instead, the plan prioritizes Green New Deal mandates and new taxpayer-funded jobs while attacking American industries that provide millions of jobs for the American people. This plan also does not propose any regulatory or programmatic changes that are desperately needed to expedite projects to expand economic development in Indian country, ensure more money goes to where it's needed most, and guarantee that the taxpayers receive the most bang for their buck. Regulatory or programmatic changes can have a tremendous impact on infrastructure and economic development, and they don't increase the burden on taxpayers. The United States Congress has a long history of passing bipartisan infrastructure packages, and we all support the premise of investing in our infrastructure to bolster our economy in every sector. For that reason, I hope the majority keeps this process bipartisan and won't resort to the budget reconciliation process, again as was done for the American Rescue Plan, where the majority ceded its jurisdiction to the Budget and Rules Committee. While many infrastructure components of the President's plan fall outside of this committee's jurisdiction, I look forward to robust discussion with our witnesses to identify how this committee, along with our tribal partners, can put together a common sense infrastructure package that will work for Indian country. Again, thank you for hosting this hearing, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you for your opening statement. We will now proceed to asking questions of our first panel of witnesses. I'm going to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witness. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. President Killer, you noted that it would take 100 years for BIA to address the Oglala Sioux tribe's backlog of road maintenance issues at the current funding rate. You also made 5 suggestions for us. If we increase the funding at your proposed levels, which I noted were not at the full level of the backlog, and adopted your recommendations, how do you think that would affect the potential timing of getting passable roads on the most urgently needed road improvements on Lakota lands?
Thank you for that question, Chairwoman, and I think starting, a lot of our community projects are put on hold, and one of the most glaring things is that you have like extreme weather conditions, as mentioned in some of the other testimony from Hawaii and Alaska, and you kind of see the effects of what happens when you delay a project because you can't predict the weather. And most notably around roads, one of the biggest things that we see is if you drive through I-90, and I was thinking of an example, if you were to go from the first side of the state to the other side of the state on I-90, right in the middle is kind of like the Badlands area, and you always notice that area is always under construction, always, and that's a federal highway, so there's resources there and all that kind of stuff. But if you imagine how many, how much roads we have in our community, in our area, we don't have that kind of attention. Where the state of South Dakota is able to use, $4,000 per mile, and we use about 900. So again, it's a tough situation, and understanding that we need to figure out how to get some of these projects moving in our community, and I think with the package coming down, it would be good to have those kind of resources put into our area and community.
Thank you very much. I really also appreciated both your statement and the statement of Chairman Aila that the idea of preparing for these more catastrophic weather events and for the climate change that we intend to be seeing. I truly appreciated the statement that we must also build the infrastructure of humanity. Chairman Aila, if you could describe a bit how you think how you think it would work to have set aside funds to deal with the catastrophic weather events and how that would work and how you would be able to implement that on and for the Native Hawaiians.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The challenge, I think, for us is because of climate change, we have these alternating flooding events with interspersed with drought conditions. So having a dedicated source of funding would allow us then to take the funding that we're using now to deal with these issues and put it into more infrastructure so we can get more people off the wait list. The increase in the amount of spending that we have to do on the various homesteads to create fire breaks, to go into existing streams and remove debris prior to weather events coming in is putting a strain on our maintenance budget. And so just recognizing that climate change is happening and that we will have to take appropriate steps in order to meet the new norm, if you will, and just an increase in spending on maintenance will allow us to take the existing money and build more homes, because that's really what's needed. You mentioned 28,000 applications and 28,000 applicants and 45,000 applications. We're not even able to provide access to the vision that Prince Kohio had.
Thank you. So I don't want to have enough time to ask to get an answer to my last question, but I will welcome perhaps feedback after this to the witnesses in terms of asking the witnesses what tribes who are encountering obstacles to carrying out these particular stages, what can the federal government do more to assist with making sure that money that is available does get spent and does get sent down to the individual tribes. I will now recognize Congressman Young, Ranking Member Young, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do appreciate the witnesses. Megan, I have to ask you one question on regulatory interference with money that you receive. I am requesting you to send the type of regulations that don't fit your district, because, like you say, we have a short growing season, construction season. I'm a farmer at heart. Construction season, and if we're running into obstacles by agencies the federal government has, I would like to see, Madam Chair, making sure that we don't eliminate regulations, but at least let them work in a time frame that will help us solve these problems. And so, Megan, I ask you that respectfully to do that. And then the second thing is, if Congress is able to provide investments in tribal health care, which we have a good system, but we need upgrading, and sanitation facilities construction as part of an infrastructure package, do you think equal weight should be given to facility replacement or to maintenance and repair?
Thank you, Congressman Young, for that question. I want to highlight some of the IHS barriers to our unserved communities, because that's a lot of the jurisdiction of this committee. With IHS sanitation funds, you cannot hook up Nahasda HUD homes. So how we cobble together new home development in our communities is really challenging. We have a housing crisis. We have 17 people living in dilapidated, substandard structures that is absolutely unconscionable. IHS sanitation funds, you cannot serve public buildings. So if we're providing first-time service to a community, we can't connect the tribal hall. We can't connect the tribal office. It doesn't make sense. There's cost caps. Like I said, it costs $350,000 to $750,000 for connecting first-time service homes. That's a high cost of construction. The IHS sanitation facilities account puts a cap at $235,000. So we can't even spend IHS sanitation facility funds in our unserved communities. When I mentioned that our unserved communities are ineligible for the funding, that leaves us with no path for service, no hope for service. So I am truly hopeful that with the American Jobs Plan, it can be directed to tribes, building on the power of Indian self-determination so that we can invest in our communities. We know we can reduce the cost of construction by coordinating that infrastructure investment with housing and roads. The other thing I want to make a huge plug for is equipment. We really need backhoes. We need, equipment to keep our roads open so that we can keep sanitation systems going. So that is really critical. That with EPA tribal funds, you need a certified operator. We need a really culturally relevant operator training. The operators in our region, they're majority Native men, yet we don't have the culturally appropriate training to make sure they can get certified. And without operator certification, we're not eligible for EPA funding. So as you can see, with each bucket of federal funding, there's particular regulations that make our unserved communities ineligible. In regard to replacement of facilities or first-time service, I really believe that tribes have the ability to make those determinations because we need to prevent catastrophic failure of public infrastructure like water storage tanks. As you know, distribution lines in Uniclete need to be replaced. And we know how to balance that. On our board at Norton Sound, it's really a beautiful experience because you have board members that are advocating for their neighboring communities. We advocate for each other. And the need is tremendous, but I know that our leaders, we know how to live with less and we know how to help each other out. We need to be empowered to reduce cost of construction through infrastructure coordination and building on Indian self-determination. Thank you for those questions.
Well, Madam Chair, that's the example of what I'm saying. It always drove me nuts because we try to put a HUD housing in. You can't put a HUD housing in with one type of money, and then the other agency doesn't want to hook up. So which comes first, the sewer and water, or does the building come? You build a building, then they put the sewer and water. Two different agencies trying to take and solve one problem. So part of this legislation should be make it more expedient and get the job done and actually cost less. So thank you, Megan. Keep up the work. We'll see if we can't do something in this legislation. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you. The chair will now recognize Representative Gallego for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I heard Mr. Representative Young was on the I-10 recently, and I was just checking. There's a couple warrants that are outstanding for Mr. Don Young from Alaska for speeding through Arizona, New Mexico, FYI. Moving on. Oh, did I freeze? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for having this important hearing. We've been talking about this for quite a while, and thank you, Mr. Young, also obviously for being here too. You know, as the past chairman of this, we've actually had a hearing on this, and we keep hearing the same things over and over again. And then this is even before the pandemic. So now the pandemic really has highlighted how serious the need for this infrastructure investment is, especially water and broadband. And Arizona, you know, being 1/3 tribal land, we really saw some huge disparities that we need to fix, and we can fix, hopefully, with the upcoming infrastructure bill that will actually remedy and focus on our tribal nations. This is also why I've introduced the Bridging the Tribal Divide Act, which will deploy broadband to tribal lands, something that we've all talked about. And we're going to have to continue fighting for more funds for just in general tribal water and broadband infrastructure, hopefully in every coronavirus package that should come in the future, and we have in the past. So we just have to continue going that way. And thank you to our witnesses. I have a couple questions. So Chairman Aila, hopefully I said that correct. In your testimony, you discussed how access to broadband is an equity issue. Can you expand on how lack of access to broadband is more likely to affect low-income Native Hawaiians and how that impacts their ability to access education or economic opportunities?
Thank you for that question. The immediate impact during the pandemic, of course, when all the children stayed home from school and remote learning was implemented, is that it became very clear the haves and the have-not. And many of our rural communities certainly ended up in the have-nots, not only in terms of opportunity at broadband with broadband availability, but also just in instrumentation available for our students. In the other end of the spectrum, we have elders who we refer to as kupuna in Hawaii, not being able to travel as readily to visit doctors. And so many of the programs that our health insurers implemented required visits via telehealth. And of course, again, not being in areas that had the bandwidth or the instrumentation, many of our elders were delayed in receiving treatment, in receiving diagnosis, in receiving care. So those are just two really quick ways of demonstrating the inequity that exists today.
Thank you. And Chairman, if you have a moment for one more question. Last Congress, I added an amendment to HR 2 requiring federal agencies to do proactive outreach and provide technical assistance to the tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations that were eligible for broadband funds. Why is it important for the government to make a proactive approach to consulting with Native communities when implementing programs for broadband or just any other types of infrastructure since we're on the subject?
It is extremely important because I think the federal government and Congress is the only entity that has the resources available to apply. With regards to tribal lands and Native Alaskan lands and Hawaiian homestead lands, it's really important that we implement these things with the cultural lens to it, so as to not implement anything that is that could be offensive, not anything that could be duplicative. Working with the communities to understand what really are the broadband needs that each unique community has. And oftentimes, because of the local geography, the solution is going to be very different for each community.
Mm-hmm. So cultural competency and cultural being able to understand cultures are just as important as the actual money to be able to implement a lot of these plans, is what you're saying.
That is correct.
All right. So thank you, Mr. Aila. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The chair would now like to recognize Congressman Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Ms. Stimfel, you, in your comments to Representative Young, you mentioned a number. It really caught me off guard, and I wanted to make sure I understood that correctly. It was I think you called it a utility connection fee. What was that? It's like $375,000, if I heard it correctly.
Yes, we have 32 communities that are unconnected to water and sewer. And to connect those homes in those communities, it costs $350,000 to $750,000 per home. So the total need in our unserved communities is $1.5 billion. And the point I want to make is we know we can reduce the cost of construction. We just have these litany of regulations that delay projects, that really increase the costs. So thank you for asking.
Well, before I came to Congress, I did engineering work. I'm actually a professional engineer, and I've never heard a number like that. Can you please elaborate on that? How on earth could you spend $350,000 to connect water and sewer to a single residence?
So as you know, a lot of our communities are off the road system, and Alaska is half the size of the United States. So logistics and transportation adds to a tremendous amount of that cost. So we have to have all of our design work done by December. So if we're ordering manufactured or prefabricated materials, most often out of Seattle, they have to be on the Seattle barge by May. Then they'll arrive in June. So it's all the transportation costs that drive it up. And what we witnessed this year is with the pandemic in manufacturing delays for prefabricated plastics, the project costs went up by 40% and projects were further delayed. And so what we really need is the ability and the flexibility to coordinate with the materials we have on the ground, with equipment we have on the ground, with other investment, roads projects, housing projects, because if we can, pre-plan all that, ship it up in a barge, we know we can reduce the cost of construction. But the way the funding works, we have to wait for it to be available. And that's sometimes waiting 5 to 10 years. And each year, those project costs increase.
So what's the average construction cost of a new home?
$650,000 for basically a HUD home. And we continue to innovate to reduce those costs of construction, but that's the average cost. I just actually built a home
I think we're
in my
having
hometown, and
connection
we did it for $350,000, but that's having cash up front. That's not, having a mortgage.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It may have just been on my end, but there was some connection problem. I didn't hear that last part. But so over half the cost of a house is in connecting utilities. And how much of that cost do you think could be driven down if the regulations and the requirements were more common sense?
That's a good technical question that I'd like to get, a technical answer back to you. For example, there's a $5 million water tank project going on that needs to go on in Diomede right now. Their insulation is failing, but due to regulations, we can't even get started. We already have the design done, but we can't even order the materials, get them on the barge so that we can get started. So I'll have to respond to you from a technical standpoint if you don't mind waiting.
Yeah, well, hopefully, if there's any kind of an infrastructure package, we can take a real strong look at this regulatory process that is obviously adding an enormous amount of cost to housing, and there's got to be a better way to do that. Looks like we're almost out of time. I had more questions about how we could streamline the NEPA process, but I don't think we'll have time to answer that today. So, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Now, Chair would now recognize Representative Garcia. Representative Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and the ranking member, and of course, all of our outstanding witnesses for testifying on the plight of all of these communities and, of course, their agendas for improving conditions. We may not always, of course, think about infrastructure as being an opportunity to advance racial equity or economic justice priorities, but the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated, for example, how internet access is a civil rights issue. Even before the pandemic, communities of color, low income households, and rural communities have struggled with the digital divide. In fact, 2/3 of people on rural tribal lands in the US lack high-speed internet connectivity, as we've heard. However, COVID-19 provided a strong spotlight on the issue, especially in Indian country, where students struggle to learn remotely and families lack access to telehealth. Question for Chair Aila in panel one. Like tribal communities in the lower 48, you share that many Native Hawaiians also struggle with access to broadband. You also state that, and I quote, if this is left to continue, the impacts of digital inequality may become an increasingly significant contributor to the widening socioeconomic gap. Why is the digital divide, Chairman, a racial equity problem, and how does it contribute to the widening socioeconomic gap?
Thank you, Representative Garcia, for that question. I can answer that question, I think, most simply by watching my nephew try to navigate remote learning. Some children respond to different stimuli, and sitting in front of a screen that you have to constantly wait for it to buffer in order to get the answer results in a child losing interest. And if that child loses interest, that child is not able to grasp the lessons that are being presented to him, and therefore falls further and further behind or requires additional hands-on on tutoring. And that as you go, from year to year, and you fall further and further behind, it has an impact on that child in terms of how he sees himself in the world, how he sees his ability to relate to other children in the same grade. And then, we have to be very careful with our children. Sometimes they do not so smart things, and we label them as not being smart, and we have to make sure that they understand the difference, that what they do sometimes is not smart, but they are extremely intelligent, and they have the ability to catch up, and they have the ability to be just as good as anyone else in society, but they have to have the tools necessary for them to keep up and to thrive.
And can you expand just a little bit more on how not having this access to broadband, for example, widens the socioeconomic gap?
Well, as he gets more and more frustrated, it's more and more difficult to get him interested in learning. And as you go through, today's world is very technologically influenced. So not having access to technology is something that makes the children that I have observed feel less important, feel less inclusive, and feel less about themselves. So that's why it's really important that they at least have, we all at least have a level playing field to start with, and we don't have that today.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair would now like to recognize Representative Obolnoti. Representative Obolnoti for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this very important hearing. It's, I think, very eye-opening for all of us to hear of the tremendous need that exists for investment in infrastructure in our Indigenous communities. And it illustrates the point that, this is a broad, bicameral, bipartisan issue. I think we all agree that infrastructure is something that exists for us collectively as government to make investments in our communities. And it's exciting to be debating this with some money actually to do that investment with. My biggest regret at this point is that such a small percentage of the package that we're considering actually goes to this kind of infrastructure. I really wish it was more. So my first question, Ms. Stimfel, in your testimony, you said something I found interesting. You said that the regulatory paradigm
needed to be altered to respect the short construction season there in Alaska. So can you tell us what changes we need to make to that paradigm that would make it easier to get some of these projects done?
Yes. As you know, Congress appropriates funding in the USDA and EPA accounts for Alaska Native villages, and the state of Alaska matches those funds. What comes with that bucket of funding is what's called best practice score criteria. And so each community is scored on their financial, managerial, and technical capabilities to run a city government and to operate those utility systems. And if you don't have a score above 60, then you're ineligible for that funding. And we know, our state is 50 years young. We're overcoming a century of trauma, to our communities, meaning loss of language, loss of way of life, trauma. So making sure we're rebuilding our society and rebuilding our communities in culturally relevant ways means that what happens with the best practice score is it renders our unserved communities ineligible for that funding that Congress is appropriating for them. So how we get our communities eligible is through working with our tribal governments and working with our tribal organizations so that we're providing services to our cities, because we know how to provide culturally relevant services. There's a whole litany of regulations. For EPA tribal funding, you need to have a certified operator. Like I said, we need operator, culturally relevant operator training. The Indian Health Service has cost caps as well as grant requirements. So the match requirements are really holdbacks because funding is really hard to come by. So when I say a new paradigm, we want to build on the success of Indian self-determination. If you think about the compacts and the contracts that we enter into with the Indian Health Service to manage and design our own programs, we want to do that with sanitation. So if we can enter into a compact with the Indian Health Service for some amount of funding, we can build our own programs, hire our own engineers, procure our own materials, hire our own labor. We need to build on Indian self-determination and have the freedom, to do that. And that's what I mean by paradigm shift. We want to move out of this regulatory environment of, check this box, check that box, wait 5 to 10 years for funding, to, all right, let's get to work. How do we, just establish our own path to service? And that's through Indian self-determination, by allowing our tribes to do that.
Sure. So, this is a common problem that we have with Indigenous peoples and connecting them with the money that they need to get these resources built in their communities. If you have specific factors that relate to the unique conditions there in Alaska and the shortness of the construction season that are preventing you from accessing these resources, please let us know after the hearing so that we can help you overcome those. Unfortunately, I think sometimes when you get into a regulatory environment where large quantities of taxpayer dollars are being spent, these two ideas are in tension. One idea that we want to get these dollars deployed as quickly as possible in your community, but also this idea that we have a responsibility to make sure that those taxpayer dollars are wisely and appropriately spent, and that requires some safeguards. So, the unique factors that are preventing you from getting those boots on the ground, I think we're really interested in helping to solve those. And then quickly, with my time that I have left, I'd like to ask a follow-up question of Chairman Aila. You had testified about a program to bring broadband to your community and a recent decision that allocated more broadband spectrum there. That sounds like a really innovative program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
And Chairman Aila, we are out of time, so I would request that perhaps we've been very respectful, all the members, of staying within time. That is a fascinating question, and perhaps if you could give a 5-minute answer and send in a written answer.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm getting the hook, but thanks to all our witnesses. I'll yield back.
Chair will now, I hate that because I wanted to hear the answer to that, but the chair will now recognize Congressman Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, on behalf of our Native Hawaiian ohana, or family everywhere, I want to say mahalo nui loa, or thank you very much to you for your sensitivity and understanding in including Native Hawaiians, the indigenous peoples of our country who originate in Hawaii, as full partners in the work of this year's subcommittee. Certainly, we look forward to that. So mahalo for that. And to Chair Aila, aloha kakahiaka, or good morning, since it is 5 o'clock in the morning in Hawaii. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your effort here today. Four straight colleagues, I think it is, have asked you about broadband in Hawaii. And I want to focus on this, Chair Aila, because it seems to me that we have the perfect demonstration in our Hawaiian homelands of the digital equity divide, as you described it in your testimony, because throughout the Hawaiian homelands, we have had investments by the federal government in broadband in large part, but not across the board. And so we have Hawaiian homelands where Native Hawaiians are residing today who have pretty good access to broadband, Hawaiian homelands who have moderate access to broadband, and we have Hawaiian homelands who have virtually no access to broadband. And so if you want to take it from a straight scientific study, we have the situation where we have Native Hawaiians, part of the same community. The distinction for them is broadband accessibility. And the direct question to you is, do you see a difference in terms of the advancement of Native Hawaiians on Hawaiian homelands who do have the broadband and who don't?
Thank you very much for that question, Congressman Case. We definitely observe a difference. The communities that have broadband, and I will highlight one community on Hawaii Island, the community in Maku'u, have band together and have had a very successful economic development effort. They have a farmers market every weekend in Maku'u. And with partnering with a local utility, we've been able to authorize access to and provide access from the local utility to each one of the houses in that subdivision now. And in addition, so them not having high-speed internet, they now have that. But more importantly, for their economic development in that community, being able to utilize the technology to swipe credit cards for customers, increases their sales, increases their efficiency, increases their ability to raise revenue because they have other projects such as community facilities that they're trying to raise money for. And so just by having partnered with the local utility to speed up the approvals, to implement and install the fiber in that area has meant a huge, has affected them positively in terms of self-worth, in terms of hope, in terms of their vision now is being expanded into other areas. And then we contrast that with our communities at South Point, where many of the pastoral lands, leases that are there don't even have water, might have access to limited electricity. So the elder residents of that community have no broadband. They have no access to telehealth. They have no access to education. They have no access to simple things that we take for granted, like looking up the definition of a word or a concept on Google. Google is foreign to them. And Google is so important in all of our daily lives today in terms of understanding concepts, understanding the latest news, understanding how to self-diagnose. You know, many of us self-diagnose today looking up symptoms on Google. So that's the disparity. And that's where I think more broadband resources will help with the equality and help with the development and that infrastructure of humanity that I referred to.
Thank you so much, Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair would now like to recognize Congresswoman Wadagan. So Congresswoman Wadagan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Fernandez and Ranking Member Young for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the panel for your testimony. I appreciate the efforts of everyone here to address these important infrastructure issues. As you may know, the LBJ Hospital in my home district of American Samoa is in dire need of replacement or repair. So I can acutely relate to some of the challenges Indian tribes and Alaska Natives face when there's a need for health infrastructure. Ms. Stimfel, in your testimony, you call for infrastructure investment and upgrades without regulatory hurdles or delay. Could you elaborate on some existing regulatory hurdles that prevent you from completely completing critical work done? And
Yes,
as a follow-up, do you believe we should address these hurdles in a final infrastructure package?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I do believe that the opportunity and the political courage and the will is now. And we have the ability to serve our unserved communities. For the Indian Health Service, the regulatory requirements are cost match requirements and cost caps. There's a cost cap for IHS sanitation deficiency system at $235,000 per home. In Alaska, our unserved communities, it costs $350,000 to $750,000 to connect our unserved homes. So we are ineligible for the funding that Congress appropriates, and it's going to take innovation and coordination to reduce the cost of construction. So we know we have the capability to do that through asset management, through IT of our systems. We want to know every pipe, every wedge, every nut and bolt, what the lifespan of our infrastructure is, so that we create some robust maintenance plans and really coordinate with other housing and road development. So the two main IHS prohibitors are cost requirements, local match requirements for ineligible structures, and those are public structures like tribal offices, and cost caps. So if you were to pass a bill without those tomorrow and we can prioritize service to unserved communities, we'll make a dent in the need, and we'll make a dent in innovation. I guarantee you that if we serve Alaska Native villages, we'll create jobs in America. Everything we order is from the lower 48 and it gets shipped up. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Representative Rosendale. Representative Rosendale for 5 minutes. Representative Rosendale, I see that you are on with us, but I don't see that you have a voice. Representative Rosendale, could you unmute, please? Representative Rosendale, could you please unmute for your 5 minutes? We will, while we attempt to correct any technical issues with Representative Rosendale, Representative Bentz, we would recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all the witnesses. I have a question for for Megan. She's been answering a lot of them, but I've been impressed by the passion and clarity of her responses. And so my question is not, well, let me state this. The Trump administration did its best to streamline NEPA, and it did so because of the delays occasioned by its application to any number of projects. And of course, I note that for purposes of construction on tribal lands, we are drawn to the Indian Affairs NEPA guidebook, just 444 pages long. And I have a feeling that these kinds of regulations come into play when you are trying to do things. Just like the other things you've called out during your answers to our various questions. So I think you have pretty much solid agreement, certainly from your wonderful Congressman Young, and all of us, that there is a problem. So the real question becomes, how do we move from all of this agreement that we have these problems with these regulations to actually doing something about it? So that brings me to, how are you organizing your 20 tribes, and for that matter, all of the tribes across the nation, to bring to the attention of those in power the problems posed by this regulatory swamp that we've created here? And I'm a lawyer. I've dealt with these regulations. I know just exactly how hard it is. But it seems to me that if people with the political power that fortunately our First Peoples now enjoy, you have a very loud voice. I am asking you, how are you marshaling that voice? To whom are you directing, other than us today, and I think you're doing a very effective job, to whom are you directing the frustration you must feel for watching people live in basically inhuman conditions? So how are you putting together a much louder noise to bring this to the attention of those who might make a difference?
Thank you for the question. I want to recognize Bita Baker with the Navajo Nation. It's through working with our tribes in the lower 48 to elevate these issues. We held a White House Domestic Policy Council listening session on these challenges in Indian country. So we're not only trying to shed light to our lawmakers, such as many of you in Washington, D.C., with that power to change, but we're also working with our local leaders. What we're doing at Norton Sound Health Corporation is creating a tribal utility cooperative. So we're starting, instead of just providing services to our tribes, our tribal governments, and our communities, we're opening and providing services to our cities, because it's our cities that own, maintain, manage, and operate utilities that for our communities. So we've hired our own engineer, and our health corporation at Norton Sound Health Corporation, we're creating a tribal utility cooperative that will serve our cities so that we can bring engineering assistance, asset management, really update and modernize how we manage utilities with remote maintenance and monitoring and technical teams. So we're working all fronts, and what we really, what is hard is when there is no hope, when you know that you're talking to our relatives who are suffering from disease because of a lack of clean water, and we cannot provide that hope without creating new paradigms. So we're politically motivated, not only with you in DC, but locally, so that we can empower our local leaders to, on their own path to service. And so it's going to take time and years, but I hope within the next 5 years, for the 6 communities that have no water and sewer in my region, that we start to lay a path to service. It costs $250,000 to do a preliminary engineering report for our unserved communities, so we can ask the technical questions. How much will it cost to serve our communities? So even if this an American jobs plan, we can have $250,000 to study water and sewer, so we can get on that path. We'd be forever grateful. Thank you for your question.
Right. So just to follow up on that, what I'm trying to say is, for us here in Washington, D.C., we need your help we need letters, emails, everything from your 20 tribes to the administration saying, do something about streamlining NEPA, do something about streamlining these regulations. It's great that you're talking to us today, but please, Marshall, you have huge power. It's just up to you to address these issues through all the folks that you have available to contact Washington, D.C. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Representative Rosendale for 5 minutes. I can see you, Representative, but we cannot yet hear you.
Can you hear me now? Apparently not.
Yes, we can, and we look forward to your questions for 5 minutes. Thank you, Representative, and thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you for your patience. Madam Chair and Ranking Member Young, and thank you to the entire panel for joining us today. Tribes often lack the adequate infrastructure for transportation, medical facilities, water and sanitation infrastructure, and telecommunications. President Biden's America Jobs Plan fails to specify the need for investment in these basic necessities, which the tribes may lack. And Ms. Stimfel, I have a question for you. As you may know, there are 31 projects located in Montana tribal communities that fail to meet sanitation standards. These projects provide drinking water and treat sewage for our tribal communities. In total, there are $2.6 billion in national backlog for water, sewer, solid waste sanitation facilities across all of Indian country. More often than not, these critical projects are delayed and costs are driven up by procedural and regulatory requirements that do not benefit Indian country in any way, shape, or form. Can you please discuss ways in which reforming the National Environmental Policy Act will improve infrastructure in Indian country?
Thank you for the question, sir. Respectfully, the NEPA process, I am not an expert in. We have an IHS staff member who solely specializes in NEPA. So because they have one dedicated staff member, that signifies how much of a work, of that issue is. What I will share, in Montana and, like many across Indian country, we rely on engineers, IHS engineers or tribal engineers to identify deficiencies and create project scopes and put them into IHS SDS. When we first started our mission 3 years ago, what we realized was that a lot of our deficiencies were not even identified. So we didn't even know the magnitude of how bad the problem was. So I can appreciate that in Montana, there's probably deficiencies that we haven't even identified yet. And so how do we solve this is we really build up tribal. We allow tribes to hire engineers at an employment rate that will support the longevity of engineers, because the other issue is we have such a high turnover in engineers, we can never see a project through fruition. So it's really supporting the IHS SDS system that to chip away at that $2 billion need. Congressman Young has introduced legislation. It's HR 1939. And if there's any elements, that we can really eliminate those IHS cost caps and match requirements, will make a dent. And it's really empowering tribes to make that dent. It's empowering tribes to establish their own pathways and innovate, and empowering the next generation, because we know how to, use IT. We know how to look for experts in engineering to reduce the cost of construction and innovate. And so, thank you for that question. I know you asked about NEPA and I didn't answer, but I hope I shed some light on IHS abilities.
Thank you so much, Ms. Stimfel, and all information is good. And if you could, for me, take that question back to your folks that are working on the NEPA process and give us some feedback, give us some direction on some areas where we could reduce that unnecessary regulation that's keeping us from fulfilling those projects. Another topic, last 4 years, I've worked in the state of Montana as the Commissioner of Securities and Insurance, and I was working at the intersection of healthcare, the delivery of healthcare and insurance. Unfortunately, many IHS facilities have been plagued by extremely low quality healthcare, and some offices have been accused of impropriety, nepotism, corruption. Congress must provide oversight to ensure that our tribal communities have access to adequate healthcare, structurally sound facilities, and further, we must address the nearly $2.2 billion backlog in IHS facilities that they face. Can you highlight the ongoing challenges that IHS facilities face and discuss ways that Congress can ensure our tribal communities have access to primary care and preventive care?
And Representative Rosendale, once again, we are unfortunately out of time, and that is such an important question. I would respectfully request that we receive that in writing, and we will have additional testimony on our next panel about IHS, and perhaps you can ask that question then, because it is a very important question. So thank you very much. And I want to thank the first panel for answering our questions. And as we noted, the members of the committee may have some additional questions or questions for which we did not have time for you to answer. And we do truly appreciate if you could send us those responses, because they are important for us to understand the scope and depth of the problem. I will now turn to the second panel of witnesses for their testimony. As with the previous panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. And we've been on enough so everyone understands how the on-screen timing will work and how I must gently remind people about the timing. The chair now recognizes Dr. Morris, who is the Executive Director of the American Indian Policy Institute at the Arizona State University. Dr. Morris, for 5 minutes.
Chukma. Hachi Chokmata, so Holchafoat, Alichi, Tracy Morris, and Chokachafa, Holchafoat, in Coney Homa, Chickasaw. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Tracy Morris, and I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. And today I'm on Autumn land, and I acknowledge their sovereignty as Indigenous people. And I thank everyone for the invitation to speak about the state of research and data on broadband in Indian country. So as the chairwoman said, I'm the executive director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University, and we're a part of the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. My area of specialty in research and publications is in tribal broadband, the digital divide, and digital inclusion. I co-authored the groundbreaking New Media, Technology, and Internet Use in Indian Countries study in 2009, and I co-authored and spearheaded the publication of the Tribal Technology Assessment in 2019. I want to emphasize that I'm not here representing either ASU or tribal nations, but rather I'm here to present Indigenous participatory research data about the digital divide in Indian country, including my own research, but not limited to my own. In addition, I'll touch on some governmental research. I just want to remind everyone that Indian country's 574 sovereign federally recognized tribal nations on 334 reservations in 35 states with over 100 million acres of land. And we're part of the family of governments in the United States, and the federal government's obligated via treaties to the trust responsibility. So as I said, I'm here to talk about the state of broadband infrastructure on tribal lands and to expand on the significance of an investment in broadband infrastructure, an infrastructure that quite literally could have saved lives if it had been in place prior to the onset of the pandemic. In looking at existing tribal broadband infrastructure data on deployment, the survey of sources is brief. All the sources paint a bleak picture, and some overstate access due to collection methods and bias. But the United States has come to know the inadequacies of broadband access in not only tribal communities, but rural communities and urban settings with the pandemic. Quantifying the stories we saw last year is moot. It's time to solve the problem that exists now, a problem that impedes economic growth, community health, education, energy, and civic engagement. According to the data in the FCC's 14th annual report of 2021 just released, 79.1% of population on tribal lands has broadband access at 25 down and 3 up. This statistic pales in comparison to urban areas at 98.8% and rural areas at 82.7%. And the disparity is even more apparent when disaggregating the data, when we see that only 67.3% of tribal lands on the lower 48 have broadband access. And the way that the FCC collects this data leads to an overstatement of coverage on tribal lands. And if we look at it that way, it's just 46.5% of the population on tribal lands that actually has adopted broadband service of 25 down and 3 up. And in 2019, the FCC found that 25% of homes on tribal lands do not have a wired option for even 10 down and 1 up. Even these best case scenarios speak to the digital divide in Indian country, and we've been hearing about it today. In 2019, the AIPI released the Tribal Technology Assessment, and this was a baseline original research study of availability, access, and use of internet by end users on reservations. And we found that 18% of respondents had no internet connection in their home, and another 33% of respondents rely on cell phone service for home internet connection. The AIPI and other researchers have also found that Native nations are building their own internet infrastructure, and we feel their efforts should be supported. Southern California Tribals Chairman's Association or Red Spectrum at Coeur d'Alene are terrific examples. These are tribal-centric models, and we know what works in our communities. The investments in broadband proposed in President Biden's jobs plan and other recent legislation are only a down payment on a digital divide that's as big as the Grand Canyon. In closing, affordable broadband access in Indian country is an urgent matter. The funding that has already been made available is just a start at closing the digital divide. We support our colleagues at NCAI and their recommendations included in the infrastructure legislative proposal released last week. And addressing broadband's only a part of the unique responsibility the federal government has to tribal governments, but it's a necessary component to build a stronger tribal economies and communities together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morris, for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walter Haas, who is the General Manager of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority in Tua.
Good morning, Chairman Lejeune, Fernandez, and Ranking Member Young, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak with you about infrastructure priorities in Indigenous communities for the American Jobs Plan. My name is Walter Haas. I'm the General Manager of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. I've been proud and honored to be the General Manager for the last 13 years. Navajo Nation is approximately 27,000 square miles. It's larger than the state of West Virginia. It extends over 13 counties in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, and there's approximately 185,000 people who reside within the Navajo Nation. While the rest of the United States was electrified in the 1930s and 40s by utilizing the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, the Navajo people were left behind. The Navajo Nation created NTUA in 1959 as a not-for-profit enterprise of the Navajo Nation to provide electricity to a Bureau of Indian Affairs school that was being built in Shiprock, New Mexico, that no other electric provider would provide service to. The council felt that they waited long enough, and the best way to get their citizens the utility services that they need and deserve was by a Navajo Nation-owned entity. We started out in 1959 with one customer. We've grown to serve over 43,000 electric customers, 8,000 natural gas customers, 18,000 communication customers, 14,000 wastewater customers, 41,000 water customers. We operate the largest fleet of off-grid solar PV units in the United States that power 496 homes. We operate the two largest solar farms that are owned and operated by any Native American community in the United States. Even with all the progress that NTUA has made, that we do not have the financial resources available to us to address all the needs of our people. We still have 14,000 homes, which is almost 60,000, I'm sorry. We have 14,000 homes without access to electricity. We have 17,000 homes that do not have running water or wastewater services. Approximately only 40% of our 67,000 homes across the nation have a landline phone in them, and tens of thousands of families are without access to telephone, broadband, or natural gas services. I grew up in Chicago. I never imagined in my life that so many American citizens lacked utility services. I'm an engineer by training, and it's just appalling to me that this exists. The federal government has not lived up to its responsibility of ensuring Indigenous communities enjoy the same standard of living as communities around them. On page 16 of my written testimony, there's a table that shows the minimum estimated cost to and timelines to address the electric, communication, water, and wastewater needs of the Navajo people. As you can see, the cost is about $4.2 billion. Now I want to share with you some incredible work that NQA has accomplished with the CARES Act funding, and I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to improve the standard of living of so many Navajo families. In a mere 4.5 months, during the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Navajo Nation, we were able to construct 1,764 infrastructure projects costing $77.2 million. They consisted of 288 communication infrastructure projects, 1,199 electric projects, 277 water and wastewater projects. And during the whole pandemic, N2A Wireless installed broadband equipment in 3,100 homes, of which more than 1,000 of the homes and units were given to students and teachers so they could afford to attend school. The teacher-student plan provided them with free equipment, free internet service for 4 months, and a 50% reduction going forward. The bad news is we had to turn hundreds of families away because of lack of service. The COVID-19 pandemic has shined a bright light on how important it is to have utility services at each home, especially clean water. To be successful in constructing utility services, NQA needs time and money and land access. I'm confident through the proposed American Jobs Plan, Congress will provide the money to guarantee that utility infrastructure needs of the Navajo people are met and construction can be completed in my lifetime. It breaks my heart every time we provide electric or water to homes, only to find out that some of the elders passed away before we were able to complete the services. Now is the time to solve the infrastructure problems for all Indigenous communities. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you today and represent the needs of the Navajo people.
Thank you, Mr. Haas, for your testimony. The chair will now recognize the Honorable Andrew Joseph Jr., who is council member for the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservations Business Council. Chairman Joseph.
Good morning, Chairman Fernandez and Ranking Member Young and members of the committee. Yuhutkini Squeezed Badgers. My name is Andy Joseph Jr. I am a member of the Colville Business Council, the governing body of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. I thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony today on this critical topic. My tribe and other Indian tribes throughout the country have faced enormous obstacles getting healthcare facilities construction using existing Indian Health Service programs. The Colville tribes request that the committee do everything in its power to ensure that Congress makes a significant investment in Indian health facilities when it implements President Biden's American Jobs Plan. In a recent letter to the House and Senate leadership, National Congress of American Indians and the National Indian Health Board and other national and regional Indian organizations requested that Congress include at least $21 billion for healthcare facilities construction in the infrastructure bill. The Colville tribe hopes that the committee will support that request. In doing so, we specifically ask that all IHS area benefits from facilities construction funds and not just a handful of projects. For the past 3 decades, most of the Indian Health facilities construction dollars have gone to projects on the healthcare facilities construction priority list. The priority list was developed in 1980s, and no new projects have been added to the list since 1992. In many cases, the priority list either did not reflect facilities needs at the time or do not reflect the current needs of tribal communities. For example, in the 1980s, the Cabo tribe sought to replace our clinic in Nispelem, Washington, with a new facility. The Nispelem Clinic was originally constructed in the 1920s as a U.S. Department of War building. It was converted for use in the 1930s as a clinic for the U.S. Public Health Service. We were told by former IHS officials that the tribe's request for a new clinic in Nispelem was near the top of the priority list, but was removed because of concerns that the facility was a historical site. To complete the 7 projects remaining on the priority list would cost an estimate of $2.4 billion. Health facilities have always been a challenge for Colville and other Portland area tribes. The selection of the OMAC Clinic by the IHS represents just the second joint venture project ever awarded to an Indian tribe in the IHS Portland area. The geographic region of the IHS that includes more than 49 tribes in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. Due to the COVID pandemic, the viability of tribes' business plan for this modest rural health facility costs just under $26 billion of construction is now threatened by a declining third-party revenue due to the pandemic that we have. Going forward, this committee should direct IHS to develop and update methodology facilities construction to accurately reflect current needs and allow for changes circumstances. In the short term, however, we urge Congress to make significant investments in Indian health facilities in the infrastructure bill and direct a large portion of the money to be distributed through the Area Distribution Fund. When Congress authorized the Indian Health Care Improvement Act in 2010, it included a new section 301F that authorized IHS to establish an Area Distribution Fund. The ADF is intended to allow of the 12 IHS areas to build, expand, and replace the healthcare facilities using facilities construction funds. The ADF also intended to provide a source of funding for staffing packages for tribes that operate under the historical low staffing levels. ADF was supported by 7 of the 12 IHS areas, organizations that collectively represent more than 500 tribes. Despite this support, IHS has not taken steps to implement the ADF in a decade since it was authorized. Again, we urge this committee in Congress to direct IHS to distribute a significant portion of any facilities construction funds that may make available in the infrastructure bill through the ADF. This will ensure that all 12 areas have an opportunity to address facility needs in this once in a generation opportunity. This concludes my testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Councilman. I'd like to thank the second panel of witnesses for their very helpful testimony describing the needs that we have. I'm going to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes the 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask. The second panel, I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. First, I might have to leave early from today's hearing, a bit early, but the chair will be taken over by Representative Case, and thank you, Representative Case, for taking over as chair if I do have to leave early. I'd also like to enter the fiscal year 2022 Indian Country Budget Request, Restoring Promises from the National Congress of American Indians to the record. Mr. Haas, many folks, when you were in Chicago before you came down, are unaware of the difficulties that tribal communities face accessing reliable utilities, living on tribal lands in rural areas in the Hawaiian homelands. Can you further explain why large-scale utility providers can't extend coverage to tribal nations like the Navajo Nation, why it's important to have utilities with the flexibility that the Navajo Nation has had with NTUA? And I'd also like, while we're at it, I'll add a two-part question that we've heard a lot in other parts about the importance of microgrids that might be powered by renewable storage and other sources, and that might be a reliable and affordable method of providing electricity for certain communities. Can you tell us what NTUA has discovered in terms of looking at that with the potential value of microgrids?
Sure. To address your first question, on the Navajo Nation, we have other electric providers in certain regions that have been traditionally here. The obstacles that they face is they're looking at their profit holders or their shareholders. And there's a whole web of federal regulations that you need to go through to actually get access to the land to build the lines. And as an example, for NTUA, the average cost of a home connection is about $40,000. $13,000 of those dollars are to do the paperwork just to get the right of way to construct. Okay, so in an area like Arizona, where Arizona Public Service Corporation serves a little portion of the nation, they don't have the resources dedicated for those folks to be able to get through all those processes. So it's very important that in a lot of instances, the actual Native American community, like the Navajos, created an entity that can work in those environments and move things forward. And it's a big concern, and it's a big cost barrier. So the 13 years I've been here, I've seen very, very little improvements in my fellow electric providers on the Navajo Nation, where at the same time we've connected up 6,000 families. I'm talking about less than hundreds of families in these other areas. So it's really a regulatory and a focus issue and a cost issue and a time issue for them. As far as the microgrids, unfortunately, in the Navajo Nation, our communities are so far, our remote families are so far spread out because of their historical homelands, and that they normally reside, a family group would reside on about 160, 165 acres of land. A microgrid really doesn't work for us because you have to have the generating unit feed a larger area of folks from a technical standpoint. That's why NTUA focused on off-grid PV units for single areas. Those units cost a little over $40,000. They're limited, but at least the folks can get some type of service. And we're looking at hoping to continue promoting that program.
Thank you. So, Dr. Morris, thank you for discussing the broadband issues. I want to get quickly to the question since we have very little time, but we've heard about the fact that there are complex and varying applications from very many places. And I would really enjoy listening to you talk about ways in which we might streamline that or coordinate in a manner so that a tribe doesn't have to go to 5 different agencies to identify funding sources. And also, if you have time, we might went out to explain how the spectrum allocation would be key to tribal broadband.
Thank you. So with regard to streamlining processes, we definitely need that. And I know that the National Congress of American Indians has proposed in their recent document to create a tribal broadband interagency working group so that everybody could work together, promote awareness across entities and such, because it is a process. And I mean, we've even created a dashboard on our website we're getting ready to publish. I'm out of time. Should I continue?
No, I'm going to impose upon myself the same request I've asked of others. We'd love, if you want to add to that statement, we'd love to receive it in writing because I think it is a very important point that you raised. And I will now recognize, I believe our ranking member has left us. So Representative Westerman, for your questions. Representative Obernolte, the chair would like to recognize you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panelists. I had a question for Chairman Joseph. In your testimony, you discussed the opinion that IHS needs to update its facilities construction methodologies and work with the tribes to address some of the problems there, which is something we've certainly heard from about before. Can you talk a little bit about what a new methodology would need to address and what factors should be addressed in that?
Yes, any new methodology that IHS adopts should be flexible and allow for change circumstances. The problem with the priority list is that there were so many projects on the list that it took decades to build them all. Anyway, I believe if the area facility distribution was implemented, Congress would show a clear direction to IHS to do that, since IHS hasn't been willing to in the last 10 years. It's like an unfunded mandate. It's never been activated by any of the directors.
So do you think that that's something that could be addressed administratively through IHS, or do you think that that's something that Congress needs to act on through legislation?
I believe that if Congress acted on it, then it would become law, and then IHS would have to follow what you all approve in the budget process.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. And you brought up the priority list, and I'm certainly aware that there have been projects that have been on there for decades. Do you think that those remaining projects still address the greatest needs in Indian country, or do you think that that needs a revamp?
I think that at one time they were, but in it's hard to imagine that a project was 40 years old or older would work with today's things. Like the COVID pandemic that has happened here. That they might actually need more spacing, to be more safe and in providing services.
Right. Well, I completely agree with you. Thank you very much, Chairman. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize Representative Garcia for 5 minutes. The chair will now recognize Representative Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and to the witnesses, thank you. We've stayed on broadband disproportionately throughout this whole hearing. I think we all understand the critical importance to Indian country of adequate broadband. And Mr. Obernolte focused his question to Chair Aila on spectrum access, which I look forward to Chair Aila's more extensive comments as well. That was a grant of unassigned spectrum arising from the Rural Tribal Priority Window under FCC. The question I have, Mr. Haas, is you made comment in your testimony about assigned spectrum that is not being applied to the benefit of Indian country residents. And I just want to investigate that a little bit further with you, because if we're giving out spectrum for valuable broadband utilization, but it is not being used for some reason because there's not an adequate profit margin in there, or there is some difficulty in utilizing that spectrum, then there's something wrong in that. And I'd like to just ask you a little bit more about that. I want to kind of get the facts straight. First of all, is that just a matter of the spectrum is there and the companies are not using it? Is that simple, and if so, why?
So it's actually a little bit more than that. So the companies are actually legally have to broadcast, but they broadcast it over such a large range it's not usable. So when you get your phone says 1, maybe 2 bars, but you cannot make a phone call. You cannot download information or data. And it's the large companies, you know, the T-Mobiles, Sprint, AT&T is working on the FirstNet, so they're using more spectrum. But it's spectrum that they bought that they're basically, I'm going to use the word hoarding. I have towers that people can see that have the equipment to broadcast that same spectrum, but the phone, that AT&T customer wants to go to the AT&T site, not my site, because they don't want to pay me the roaming charge. So it's not usable spectrum, and it's very, very dangerous, especially in homes, because only 40% of my homes have a landline. So people use the mobile service for emergencies. So they have to drive to a hill to make a phone call while there's an emergency. Someone's having a heart attack in their home or some other emergency that's going on. So that's the situation. It's not only broadband, it's even making a phone call. That's how serious it is.
So is the issue of broadband infrastructure availability separate from the issue of spectrum access and utilization? Am I confusing the two issues, or are they in fact related? Are the companies exercising available broadband infrastructure but insufficiently exercising the access that they control to that infrastructure?
So to answer your question, they're both interrelated questions. So spectrum can work for broadband and internet just as it works for phone or voice. So they're both related. And what the companies have made a decision is it costs more money to put up that additional tower and those additional broadcast units to make the spectrum usable for the customer. So they've made a conscious financial choice that those people, there's not enough of those people to support the deployment of that equipment. Yet they don't want to let the tribal entities utilize it on their behalf because they don't want to pay for those fees or have those customers leave their system to come to a roaming system situation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Haas. And also, Dr. Morris, I'm just going to make a request to both of you because, of course, we can condition the grant of spectrum access on service to underserved communities. And that trumps the companies not wanting to pay for it for whatever reason. And the cost of that is spread out over a broader base. And we all essentially pitch in to be able to provide that kind of spectrum access and infrastructure access, for that matter, to communities that are underserved, such as in Indian country. So I would love to have any further comments from you for the record along these lines for specific fixes. Should we, in fact, try to go down the road of a greater requirement for the spectrum grants to provide this kind of access that seems to be lacking? Thank you very much. Yield back.
The chair will now recognize Representative Rosendale. Representative Rosendale, if you can unmute and turn your video on.
Are we live?
We are. Looking forward to your questions.
Okay, this is for Mr. Joseph. In Montana, there's a need to close, just like many areas, the digital divide. According to the FCC, tribal lands are 4.5 times more likely to lack access to broadband. And in Montana alone, only 50% of tribal populations have access to broadband. We've heard comments about the negative impacts of inadequate access to our tribal communities, how that affects them. Can you discuss various ways we can provide our tribes with broadband?
Is that question for me? Okay. Well, I what I'll do is I got my phone here, and when we lose our LTE signal that's provided by like AT&I or AT&T and or Verizon, our towers that we have on the reservation, if it goes down to a 4G signal, we're not able to download any attachments that come in email. So if you come here to my reservation with your fancy phones, and you get out of range, you're gonna not be able to actually pick up the messages, and sometimes you won't be able to even look at email because it downgrades to a 4G network, and it's really frustrating for our children, that are trying to go to school and learn. We bought them tablets that with a lot of some of the CARES money, so that they would be able to do their schoolwork. And anyway, some places they're having to drive to a spot and snowy conditions throughout the year, and some of them, they had to stay in a running car while it was cold outside, and the children had to take turns getting into the classes, and anyway, some of them didn't have no access. Some of them couldn't afford to drive to these hot spots where they could get a good signal, and we are working on trying to get broadband, because it will give us a better signal than what the local telephone companies provide.
And what are some of the things that you're doing to expand that access?
Well, we got these portable towers that are going to be hitting some of the real isolated positions, and because we have 3 mountain ranges that go down through our reservation, we come into areas where there's no signal at all, and there's no telephone service, and there's some houses might have wire, but it's really a slow network compared to what broadband could bring to us.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I'll yield the balance of my time back.
Thank you so much, Representative. The chair would now like to recognize Representative Soto. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We know that our tribal communities need to be part of the Build Back Better plan, the American Jobs Plan. For far too long, we've seen both tribal nations and territories be put in second-class citizenship when it comes to a lot of the investments in our country. We're not doing that anymore. I know in Florida we have both the Seminole tribe, which has rural and suburban and urban parts of their tribal lands. We have the Miccosukee, predominantly rural, and also Porch Creek, predominantly rural in the northern part of the state. And we see challenges limiting growth and economic prosperity in many tribal nations because of a lack of infrastructure, particularly a lack of access to internet. So I want to ask a question or set of questions to Mr. Walter W. Haas, of the General Manager of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. Mr. Haas, your testimony mentions how cell phone service in many areas of the Navajo Nation is limited because major carriers own the majority of spectrum, but are not adequately deploying equipment to allow a mobile phone user to make a call. So my first question is, how is this lack of spectrum equipment affecting tribal residents living in those areas?
Well, great. So I want to clarify one thing. So the FCC granted those companies the licenses, and the minimum broadcast requirement for the licenses make it so, and they operate at the minimum level so that the device doesn't work. So you cannot make a phone call. So it's a very serious health and emergency issue for folks who don't have a landline phone in the home that have an emergency arise, or for a lot of our children, this last year was a lost school year because there was no broadband connectivity and there was no service. So requiring people that have the spectrum to put up the equipment so it's usable is the thought I was trying to get across to everybody. And if they're not willing to do that, then they should have to relinquish that spectrum so that others could utilize that spectrum to benefit the community members. That was the point I was trying to make. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Mr. Haas, have these issues influenced discussions of spectrum sovereignty at the Navajo Nation? How is this holding back sovereignty in the Navajo Nation?
Well, it's holding back the whole education system and the healthcare system. And that basically is the root of pretty much all of our lives, to be honest with you. There is one good news piece, is that the federal government did allow the Navajo Nation to get the 2.5 spectrum that wasn't allocated in the area. But that spectrum is really going to be focusing on broadband to the home. It's like a 5G spectrum. But that is where the government has become self-sufficient and taken that spectrum. And now we need the dollars to buy the equipment to deploy the spectrum and to get it into people's homes so that they can utilize it. So that's a perfect example where the community came together and got spectrum of value. And now it's a matter of, we need the dollars to deploy your proper equipment in the end users' homes.
And Mr. Haas, I want to paint a picture for the folks back in Central Florida that I represent. For Navajo Nation, how big of a tribal nation is this? Is it rural, or are there a lot of dense areas, or and how does that affect the spectrum issues?
So it's a very rural community. There's 27,000 square miles. So it's the size of the state of West Virginia. It only has 185,000 residents that live on it. So our largest communities are only 5,000 or 6,000 folks. And we have a lot of mountains, and we actually have some forest areas. So that kind of paints the picture of the actual terrain and the difficulty of getting the equipment out in those areas where the actual people live. The other thing is the Navajo people historically and traditionally are agricultural based, but they also live very, very far apart from each other. So a family would live on 165 acres of land because the land is very barren, and they needed that historically to support themselves. So that kind of gives.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haas. We know both in tribal nations in Florida and across the nation, and rural America in general, this is going to be a game changer for agricultural communities in our district and across the nation. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Soto. So this concludes the question and answer period of our hearing, and I really appreciate the insightful answers to the many questions. We heard today about the fact that we need to not only have an infrastructure that allows us to, but the infrastructure that we need, as one of the witnesses said, is really an infrastructure that is needed for humanity to restore our hope. And that we have multiple funding sources that are not coordinated, and we should look at that in addition to the fully funding this, because to have an Indian health clinic on a priority list for so long, and so many Indian health clinics not constructed and therefore not existing during this pandemic is really problematic, and that we must implement, make sure that as we construct that, we are very aware of implementing these programs through a cultural lens and doing it in a manner that strengthens self-determination and economic sovereignty. So I thank you for the witnesses. I thank the members for the questions. As I stated before, the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be kept open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.